Welcome to the Trad Dads podcast, where we examine cultural and political issues through the lens of traditional thought.
All right, so today I want to take a step away from sort of practical stuff and policy issues and tackle kind of a more core economics concept that I think is still useful when you're having conversations with people who are very committed to a sort of liberal economic policy worldview. And so what I want to do is I want to talk through kind of what was sort of the beginning of the crisis of morality that I kind of had, let's see, about 3 years ago, back in June of 2016. And specifically, I started to realize that there was this divergence between what I claimed to have as a moral view as a Catholic, and I've been Catholic since 2007. I converted when I was in college, to, the difference between that moral perspective and the kind of economic policy paradigm, not just the policy views, on specific things, but the paradigm that I held at the time. And so I started to realize that there were some problems, there were some gaps between these two things for me. And I was trying to figure out how to reconcile this stuff. And so I'm going to put a link to this blog post that I wrote back then on my old blog that is now defunct. And just kind of, you'll be able to see all the sources and see where I'm quoting from and stuff like that in this blog post. So that should keep things nice and tidy. So essentially what had happened is I had read an article in the Wall Street Journal that had an interview with an economics commentator guy that I really enjoyed listening to at the time. And I just want to read a couple paragraphs real quick from that interview to kind of set up what was happening in my head. So this is from the Wall Street Journal interview with Russ Roberts. Economics fancies itself a science, and Mr. Roberts used to believe, as many of his peers do, that practitioners could draw dispassionate conclusions, but he has in recent years undergone something of a crisis of economic faith. The problem is, you can't look at the data objectively most of the time, he says. You have prior beliefs that are methodological or ideological about the impact of things, and that inevitably color the assumptions you make. A recent survey of 131 economists by Anthony Randazzo and Jonathan Haidt found that their answers to moral questions predicted their answers to empirical ones. An economist who defines fairness as a quality of outcome might be more likely to say that austerity hurts growth, or that single-payer healthcare would bend the cost curve. The paper's authors quote Milton Friedman's brief for value-free economics and reply that such a thing is no more likely to exist than is the frictionless world of high school physics problems. So that's the end of the quote there from this article. And, it was interesting for me at the time, just remembering, when I had read this. It was sort of coalesced a lot of the thoughts that I had at the time, because I had been kind of just thinking through this issue of, okay, can I really sit here and say that, every time someone disagrees with the sort of the ostensible conclusions of economics or economic theory as I understood it, the paradigm that I understood it in, can I really say that, is my best defense honestly, well, you don't understand economics, right? Because that is what you hear. When someone, when someone comes up to, when someone says, well, I think we should have, pick your thing, right? We should have, some kind of trade policy, right? We should have tariffs or something. Then, the response of the sort of very online economist is, well, you just don't understand economics. You don't understand what that would do. The negative effects of that, right? And so, and this is where, you start to see this, the silliness of this thing that in economics we call the normative positive distinction, right? So in economics, the standard line is that we can draw this bright line between positive analysis, which is just, well, what will happen if, we tweak this policy, or if we, allow this thing to happen, if we allow gas prices to fluctuate on the market without any kind of influence, or if we tax this more, tax this less, what will happen? How will people respond? So that's one, sort of flavor of economic analysis that's supposedly, over here on one side, right? This is positive analysis. Whereas normative analysis, we're told, is, so here's where we get at, policy questions. Well, what should we do, right? What is the, welfare enhancing solution? What is the welfare maximizing solution? What is the Pareto optimal, et cetera. And so what economics has done is developed all of these sort of devices, these economic analysis devices that supposedly generate some kind of, analytical solution to what is obviously inherently a political problem. And I'm kind of, I don't know, I guess I'm foreshadowing a bit here. And so, one way to kind of put this a little more neatly is to think about a specific, concern within the normative frame of economics, and that would be externalities. So an externality, for those who aren't super familiar with economics, according to the Google dictionary, is a side effect or consequence of an industrial or commercial activity that affects other parties without this being reflected in the cost of the goods or services involved, such as the pollination of surrounding crops by bees kept for honey. So it's kind of interesting that they use bees kept for honey as an example, because it's kind of funny that because there actually is a market for honeybees, and there was a professor up in the Pacific Northwest who kind of delivered on this idea. But you can imagine it, probably most easily, you can imagine it as like a pollution thing, right? So let's say you have you have a house downriver from my factory, right? And my factory, I just kind of go out and dump my waste from my facility into the river, and then that kills the fish, or makes the water smelly, or whatever, next to your home down the river from my factory, right? And so the idea is that, depending on the institutional structure, right, the laws or the regulations that exist, in theory, this is an externality, right? Because because I'm not paying the cost of the disposal of my waste product, right? And that waste product is imposing a cost on you, right? And namely, it's killing the fish, or it's contaminating your soil, or it's contaminating the air, or something like that, right? So this is sort of the standard argument from economics, from a normative perspective, when we start to talk about you know regulation and stuff like that, and especially I don't know, environmental regulation. But it could be anything. Could be anything. I mean, it literally could be like the fact that you smile at people, right? And they're not. This is the silly example you get in some of these economics classes. Oh, well, you smile at someone, and so it's a positive externality, because they're not paying you for the instead of that smile imposing a cost on you like the pollution did. Now the smile is benefiting you, right? Because you find that person attractive or something. And so that because you're not explicitly paying them for that smile, then they're not able to be compensated for the benefit that they're granting you, right? I mean, this is, you can obviously apply the concept to these ridiculous things, and maybe that helps get the point across to the class or whatever. But so yeah, I was really troubled by this discussion of externalities, and really just this idea that it felt like I was supposed to be, because I'm an economist, I'm automatically supposed to be a utilitarian, right? I'm automatically just supposed to take the output of these these so-called normative analyses, right? And just simply apply them. And anytime I disagree, right? Anytime I think that we should have tariffs, or that certain types of regulation are a good idea, or maybe a bad idea, for reasons outside of simply what an economist model can count up, right? In theory, we can, it's like, oh, we can measure the externality, right? We can measure the problems that are created by, certain environmental pollutants, or we can measure the reduction in GDP due to, tariffs, or quotas, or those sorts of things, right? I mean, these are examples. And in my head, I'm like, well, wait a minute. So you're saying that because I agree with you that, from sort of I guess if we're going to maintain this bright line between positive and normative, right? Because I agree with you that a tariff would reduce GDP per capita per person in the United States, then therefore I have to commit myself to saying we should never use tariffs. Well, that seems idiotic. What if there are other considerations outside of purely GDP, right? Um, and just as a quick aside, this gets to a lot of these discussions that the right has within itself, right? So you have, folks like, oh, I don't know, the Acton Institute or Tom Woods or whatever on one side, then you have, I don't know, maybe Orrin Cass or Sohrab Ahmari, or people like this on the other side, right? And it devolves into this silly, well, you don't understand economics. It's like, no, they just have a slightly broader view of what is legitimately a moral question. And so so someone on the Orrin Cass or Sarah Omari, I'm not putting words in these people's mouths. I'm just using them as examples, right? They would say something like, well, all you care about is GDP, right? And so then the Tom Woods or Acton Institute side would come back and say, well, that's not true. We care about all kinds of stuff. We care about people being good members of their community and blah, 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 blah. We just don't think that it's okay for the government to do X, Y, Z, right? And it's like, okay, well, hold on a second. See, this is the thing, is because now we're having a disagreement about the effectiveness of the policy, right? Now we're having a disagreement about what are the effects of the tariff, right? And so, to some extent, it's kind of interesting that, the claim from the Acton Institute side is that, well, you don't understand economics, right? Talking to the Orrin Cass of the world, right? And then the response is simply that, well, no, it's just that we don't think economics is everything, right? We don't think we don't think people should be obsessed with GDP, because literally every time we say, let's impose tariffs to protect jobs, it's like, well, that's silly because GDP per capita is going to go down, and some people might lose their jobs with free trade, but that's okay, they'll be compensated somehow. And it's like, well, maybe they won't, right? Maybe in real reality, in concrete reality, they won't be compensated, right? It's like, oh, well, in the long run, blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, in the long run. So how long is that, right? And in the real world, how long is it going to take for these adjustments to take place, right? How do you expect a 55-year-old dude who has 3 kids and lives in West Virginia to retrain? Are you going to tell him to learn to code? You see, so I think part of it is it's this whole confusion that gets created by this normative positive distinction, and then the other part of it is just a fundamental moral consideration between this idea of free markets and hands off, the government can't do anything, versus, well, the most important thing is community. The most important thing is a reduction in risk and security and stuff like this. And so obviously, these policy tools are perfectly fine, right? I don't care if you're going to sit there and wave a yellow flag at me and say don't step on the snake, or or taxation is theft, blah blah blah. These are just platitudes, right? This is just not how humanity works, and it's certainly not incumbent on Catholic or any type of Christian really to take these hyper liberal Enlightenment era perspectives necessarily. And so what ended up happening, kind of back to my blog post here, is I ended up finding this article in, let's see, the Journal of Institutional Economics, which is that's a solid journal. And essentially, it's an article called "Externalities as a Basis for Regulation: A Philosophical View." And so I have it linked. It's probably behind a paywall, so you'd be able to read the abstract, and that would be about it. But I pulled an abstract, or I pulled an excerpt from the introduction in there, and then I kind of had some discussion in the blog post. But I want to read a short quote from another section of the paper in the conclusion. And so let's see here. Professor Clausen, who is a philosopher, right? So he's a philosopher writing an article in the Journal of Institutional Economics, in an economics journal, talking about externalities, right? So these external costs, this the garbage, the cost that's imposed on you when I dump my garbage in the river, upstream from you. The cost imposed on people and the basis for regulating people's behavior. So is it okay for the government to use regulation to fix these problems? And so what he says is, this is the last part of his conclusion. Third, what these basic interests are in the end is a matter of political dispute. So he's referring to the interests of the public, right? What do people value? What do people care about? Do people care about community? Do they care about individualism? Do they care about the rights of the state? Do they care about bread lines? Whatever, it doesn't matter. These basic human interests. Third, what these basic interests are in the end is a matter of political dispute. Economists who have complained about the politicization of externality analyses have simply failed to accept the inherently political nature of questions about the organization of social and economic life. I mean, and that was, for me, that was just, it was so great, because everything just sort of coalesced in my head, and I was like, I get it now. Economics claims to be, the queen of the social sciences, right? We're supposed to just think, oh my goodness, look at how wonderful economics is, right? And economics can just sort of absorb all the other social sciences within it by just kind of modifying the names. Like, political science and economics is just called public choice, right? So now we have this thing called public choice. Now we can just completely consume all of political science. It's not an independent field now. It's just it's part of the it's one of the subjects, the subfields of economics. And it's just so silly, because, of course, this is people, normal people, right? Before the Enlightenment, people did not, determine moral questions by trying to figure out, how many utils were, produced by this activity. I mean, this is just, it's sick and it's weird. This whole utilitarian framework that economics kind of sneaks in, right? And I talk about this a lot. Economics sneaks in a lot of moral and ethical principles, and just sort of hides them under this rubric of, oh, this is just straight economics, folks. There's no moral judgments here. Well, I don't buy it. And so, like I said, I think this paper is interesting. If you have academic access, it's probably worth reading. If you can get it for free. But essentially, the point I want to make here, just to kind of summarize, is that you have to be careful the ways in which people will try to sneak moral and ethical views under the guise of just sort of straight-laced economic analysis, right? And even when they're going to say it's a normative analysis, right, they still won't admit to all of these moral assumptions they're making, right? And they're still saying, well, only the costs and benefits that we can count, that we can measure, are valuable. And so I want to, I put a tweet out on the Trad Dads Twitter earlier today, and I said something, I don't have it pulled up right now, but I said something like, look, the reality is all externalities are depend for their existence and their magnitude are determined politically. Period. End of story. There is no externality in a realistic sense. Okay, yeah, we can give silly examples like like the smiling thing, or like there's only one person living downstream from me from my factory. Well, that's silly, right? There wouldn't ever just be one person who would be affected. And so these things are obviously political, right? And so there's a certain subjectivity to them in the sense that if the public does not value the things that are being that are being destroyed, right? They don't perceive the costs, right? Then it's very hard for you to come up with some kind of way of internalizing those external costs, right? Or external benefits even. So I think just the main reminder is don't let something like economics dictate your morality. And I think we do have a huge problem with that on the right and within Catholic circles in both cases, right? The sort of fusionist right wing has a huge problem with this. And to some extent, the Catholic right wing has a problem with this, and it's not good. It's a problem. And there are several issues with it. Firstly, it's you're putting you're vesting an institution or an entity or a group of people with more moral authority than they actually should have. And second of all, it's just bad economics in my mind, right? It just is. Economics is when it's done well, it's done in a fashion that is as purely positive as it can be. And of course, it can never be 100% purely positive, but as purely positive as it can be. Anytime we talk about applying economics and economic policy, we have automatically entered the realm of normative economics that is not that is political inherently, and that has costs and benefits that are unmeasurable, but must be taken into account. So with that, I'll sign off. I want to thank you so much for listening. For everybody who is downloading on the podcast apps, I love it. Thank you so much. I appreciate our YouTube subscribers as well. Please, if you would like to support us, one really easy way to support us, support me, I guess, the Trad Dads podcast, and my other efforts that are in the works, would be to go from listening on YouTube to downloading on the podcast app, because then I'm able to run the ads and get a little kickback out of those ads. You can also support directly through Anchor. Anchor's been a great platform so far, with all these platform wars and everybody, talking about, everyone getting kicked off. I think Zero Hedge was just kicked off Twitter today for saying something about the coronavirus. So, Anchor is doing well on that front so far. So, but, things are in the works on the platform end too. So, no announcements right now, but please stay tuned. Again, thanks again for listening.
Thanks for listening to the Trad Dads podcast. If you enjoyed our show, please subscribe on your favorite podcast app and consider giving us a 5-star rating on iTunes. It really helps us out.